Hi guys, my name is Dray and welcome to True Crime Tuesday, where once a week I sit down with you guys and I share a true crime story in relation to murder, disappearances, cults, and more. If this is your jam and you are a true crime freak like myself, I would highly suggest liking and subscribing. And we can go on a cute little date night every Tuesday where we sit down and we talk about true crime together. It'll be really cute. I'm actually really excited to start this YouTube channel. I've been wanting to do it for the longest time. So genuinely, from the bottom of my heart, I actually really appreciate that you're here today. So without further ado, let's get into today's story. For today's story, we are taking it back to 1983, where a little girl by the name of Nasifa was born. Now, just for clarification, Nasifa actually eventually changes her name to Sabrina. For the sake of the story, so we don't get confused, and by we, I mean myself, I'm just gonna call Nasifa Sabrina. So Sabrina is one of 4 siblings, and at that time her and her family are living in Algeria. Now, because of the conflict in the region, her and her family decided to pick up from Algeria and move to France. So it was said that she had moved to France when she was quite young. Our sources online are not 100% conclusive of Sabrina's upbringing and her childhood. But according to Sabrina, her childhood was very rough, it was very traumatic, and she said that she had a very poor upbringing where often her family didn't have enough food to put on the table. They were forced to sort of go out and look for scraps, but even when they left their home, they were faced with the danger of things like sexual assault, rapes, gang violence. She just described her childhood to be a very rough and very hard. Sabrina was known to be a very attractive, beautiful, charming young lady, and at the age of 19 she is working at this crepe stand at a fun fair, and she catches the eye of 24-year-old Ouissem Medouni. Now, right away, Sam was captured by her beauty and he began to relentlessly pursue Sabrina, and eventually they had dated. Sabrina had him wrapped around her little finger. It was said that Sam was absolutely smitten with Sabrina and would always do what she says. Sabrina, on the other hand, was described to be very manipulative and not loyal. She would regularly cheat on Sam, and every single time when Sam found out, he would actually just take her back. There were even times where she would break up with him completely, but Sam would just take her right back. So they had an on-again, off-again relationship. Now, during the off periods, she would obviously go off and date other men, and a lot of her exes have come forward and have described her to be a lunatic. So apparently she would have these severe change in moods all the time, and there was really no explanation for why she would go from being really happy and really loving and affectionate one minute to being really aggressive and abusive and just unpleasant. But anyway, 3 years later, in 2005, she decides to move to London to start a new life. So at this point, Sabrina changes her name from Nasifa, which is her birth name, to Sabrina. So when she came to London, she actually worked as an au pair. So if you don't know, an au pair is essentially a foreign worker who comes from overseas, and they tend to live in a family. So we call them a host family. So the host family would expect the au pair to help out with chores such as cleaning, cooking, looking after the kids. And in return, they would obviously get to stay in their house, be able to eat meals in the house, and they also got a little bit of pocket money. A lot of young girls tend to be au pairs for the experience of being able to live in a foreign country, to learn a new language, experience culture from a familial unit, I guess the safety of a family, I guess. So that's essentially what an au pair is. Now, you will see in a second why this is ironic that Sabrina worked as an au pair. So Sam, of course, follows Sabrina eventually to London, and he works as a financial analyst at a bank, and apparently he has a very stable job. And I guess he loves Sabrina so much that he moved for her. But bear in mind, at this point, I don't think that they were dating. So Sabrina actually did a wonderful job of reinventing herself. She started to become a fashion designer, a makeup stylist. She even dabbled in a Korean songwriting, I believe. So she was actually slowly starting to make a name for herself, and she is in the scene. So in 2011, Sabrina meets a man by the name of Mark Walton, who is a member and a founder of a boy band named Boyzone. Boyzone was a very popular Irish band at that time, and Mark Walton was known to work with big name celebrities including Enrique Iglesias, Lady Gaga, as well as J-Lo. The way that Sabrina and Mark had kicked off the relationship was really, really interesting. So Sabrina had met Mark at a bank. So Sabrina was in line to see a bank teller, and she turns around and she sees this really, really good looking blonde guy with really nice blue eyes, and she's like, he's cute. She goes up to the bank teller and says, that guy's really cute. Do you have his number? Do you have his details? And the bank teller essentially says, I can't give that personal information. You're gonna have to approach him. So she goes up to the side and she waits around, I guess. And then Mark goes up to that same bank teller and says the exact same thing. He goes, she's really cute. Do you have the details? And the bank teller thought at that time that was actually really cute because they both essentially had this attraction towards each other, and they both had asked the bank teller for assistance, I guess. But eventually they started talking at that bank, and Sabrina at that point is like, hey, take down my number and come meet me at this bar. And Mark is ecstatic. He's so happy that he lands this date with this really, really beautiful woman, and she wants to meet tonight. So Mark walks up to this bar. He is really excited for his date, and he sees Sabrina, but he sees Sabrina with 10 or 11 other men. And at first he's really confused. So he goes and sits down, and he realizes that Sabrina had actually invited all these different men who all thought that they were on dates with her. But essentially she had gathered them here to sell a bunch of phone plans. So it turns out that Sabrina was part of this pyramid scheme and was wanting to sell these plans that weren't very cheap, mind you. But essentially everyone had left except for Mark. So Mark and Sabrina started talking. Eventually, Mark did buy one of these phone plans, but it was very clear that Mark wasn't interested in hearing about the phone plans, but actually wanted to get to know Sabrina. It was said that the pair grew really close really quickly. They would talk on the phone all the time. They would go on dates. It was saying that they were growing really, really close because Sabrina had shared about her traumatic childhood, and Mark stepped into this really protective and nurturing role for Sabrina. And 5 months after they started dating, they moved in together. But unfortunately, the honeymoon phase didn't last forever, and Mark started to know a very dark and abusive side to Sabrina. For example, one night Mark was sleeping and he woke up to this intense feeling of pain on his face, and he realized that Sabrina had punched him in the face. And he goes, "Why did you just do that?" And she says, "You were snoring." What? And there's also another incident where they were shopping together, and apparently Sabrina wanted, I don't know, shoes, jewelry, something. She wanted something. And Mark essentially just said, no, let's keep walking. And apparently she made a massive, massive scene. Exactly like how a toddler would probably throw a tantrum at Woolies if the mum said no to getting a pack of snakes. She lost it. She was like, you're broke, you're not a good man, you're not looking after me. And apparently she yelled at the top of her lungs, "Mr. Boyzone has no money." I'm like, girl, get your own. If you want it, get it yourself. Anyway, Sabrina was also said to be really, really jealous and really envious, so she constantly accused Mark of cheating. So at this time, Sabrina had another kid from a separate relationship, and they had all these different nannies that they had to fire because she kept accusing them of cheating with Mark. So she decides to hide cameras in Mark's house in order to, I guess, catch Mark red-handed. But obviously nothing ever happened. There wasn't even a conversation where it was slightly or remotely inappropriate, but she was still so convinced that Mark was cheating. But Mark had a lot of loyalty and had a lot of patience when it came to Sabrina. I guess she had a really special place in his heart because he just wanted to protect her, especially given everything that happened to her in her childhood. Eventually, Sabrina ends up being pregnant. Now, Mark is super excited. He's super happy. And Sabrina, I guess, seems to be really excited about that new chapter of their lives. But unfortunately, soon enough, Sabrina's mom actually falls sick. And Sabrina decides to go back to France to help be with her mom. Mark is super supportive of Sabrina going. He remains in London, but Sabrina flies back to France. Now, one day, Mark got a phone call, and it was Sabrina. Mark was like, "Hey, babe, what's going on? What's happening? How's everything in France?" And Sabrina replies in a really nonchalant tone, saying, "I had a miscarriage, and I think we should just move on from this." Mark is devastated. He is so sad. He was so excited to bring this baby into the world, and he really, really cared for Sabrina, so he was just shattered when he heard the news. Soon later, Mark decides to call Sabrina's brother, who's also living in France. I guess somewhere in the conversation, he brings up what happened to Sabrina and the miscarriage, and her brother is just super confused. He's like, "Mate, what are you going on about? Like, Sabrina is fine. She has a baby. It's all good. Why are you stressing?" And Mark is so confused at this point. His girlfriend has said that she had a miscarriage of her child and his child, and he's devastated. But now hearing this news, he's just super confused. And I guess Mark asked more questions, but he had brought up Sabrina's version of her childhood to her brother, and her brother again is super confused. He's like, "What, where are you hearing this? We had a really decent childhood. Yes, we weren't the richest, but we definitely weren't fighting for scraps, and we didn't grow up in a bad neighborhood." And according to Sabrina's brother, they actually grew up really well off. So I think this may have been the straw that broke the camel's back, because eventually Mark decides to end things with Sabrina after the 2-year relationship together. But of course, Mark still wanted to look after Sabrina and their child together, so he got them a granny flat in Southfields. He even paid for the first 6 months of rent, so she wouldn't have to stress about, I guess, working while she was taking care of the baby. Sabrina, of course, she was not happy with the relationship ending at all. So she went on a massive smear campaign against Mark and had called up a bunch of his big name celebrity clients and had said, "Hey, I don't know if you know, but you're actually working with a child pedophile." So she was relentless in wanting to make sure Mark looked like the bad guy. Something else she said was that he was using black magic on her. I don't know, it's just really, really bizarre. And I did forget to mention that she had accused him of sexually abusing her cat. Now here's the thing, because she doesn't even have a cat. So this girl, I don't know. I just think if you're gonna lie about something, try and do a good job, especially if you're going after celebrity. Have your receipts. But no way, shape, or form am I condoning this behavior. But anyway. Now, because Sabrina is essentially dragging Mark's name down in the dirt, Mark decides to stop financially supporting her, and Sabrina loses it. But Sabrina has a long time on again, off again boyfriend by the name of Sam, and she runs back to him, I guess, and they eventually move into the granny flat together, where now the family unit is made up of Sam, Sabrina, and their 2 kids, so one of which is Mark Walton's kid, and one of which is a kid from one of Sabrina's old lovers. I don't know why I said lovers, but you get the point. At this point, all Sabrina can focus on is Mark, and she is obsessed and she's not letting go. So now it's starting to impact her family life, quality time spent with Sam, as well as her work. So Sam and Sabrina decide to hire a nanny by the name of Sophie Lionnet, who is 21 years old. Sophie Lionnet was born on the 7th of January in 1996 in Troyes, which is, I think, the northeast of France. And she was known to be a very gentle, a very beautiful, and very caring girl. So she was really keen to come to London to learn English as well as to experience the culture. And she was just really, really passionate about working with kids. After she had completed high school, she decided to study childcare and go into training for that. She wanted to search for au pair jobs in London. And when she came across what seemed like a very normal and cute family who lived in this little granny flat in London, she thought they're a perfect match. She applied and she was successful, and she flies over to London for a trial period before she completely commits to the family. So the start of her employment with Sem and Sabrina was brilliant. It was said that she was really, really enjoying herself, and she would frequently call back her mum to talk about how good everything was. It's said that at the start, Sabrina and Sophie were actually really, really close. They would spend a lot of time chatting over teas in the kitchen, and because Sabrina worked in the fashion industry where she had, access to really nice clothes and she knew how to do makeup, she would frequently give Sophie these little makeovers, and the pair had a really good time together. She was also doing really, really well with the kids. So apparently the kids really loved her. They really loved being around her. And she was just a really well-liked person. She was well known in the area amongst the other au pairs. And she was just known to be an all-round beautiful human. I think the agreement was that Sabrina would get paid around £63 a month, which isn't much, but it was said that she would use a portion of the salary to teach kids in the neighborhood how to run a lemonade stand. So she helped them get ingredients, taught them about profits. She was just really involved in the community, and seems like everyone really liked her. Sabrina and Sem, on the other hand, did not have a good reputation in the neighborhood. Apparently, they would always leave garbage out, they would block neighbors' driveways, they were super rude to some of the shop owners and staff. There's a story of Sabrina going to a grocery store. So the cashier had scanned through all her items, and as she was about to leave, she realizes that she doesn't have a wallet. So she's like, oh, I'm just going to take these groceries and I'll come back and pay for them. And the shop assistant is like, I don't think that's how it works. You can come back with your wallet and then you can pay for it and then take your groceries out, but I can't let you take your groceries out without paying for them. And she loses it. She just goes full on Karen mode, and she escalates it to the point of calling the police. Now, police come to the scene and they're like, okay, what's happening? And they explain everything that's going on. And they're like, okay, ma'am, we're gonna have to actually escort you out because you are in the wrong. But that is just embarrassing behavior. I'm actually getting secondhand embarrassment. Can you imagine calling the police and then they're the ones that take you away? Believe it or not, that wasn't Sabrina's main red flag. She was still obsessed with Mark. This obsession was turning into a delusion that sadly involved Sophie. At the time the story takes place, Mark is out in LA. He's living his best life. He is, I guess, focusing a lot on his career. So he is nowhere near London, nowhere near Southfields. But for some reason, Sabrina started to suspect that Mark had hired Sophie to spy on them. So essentially, she had a theory that Sophie would let Mark in that granny flat every night, and Mark would come in and essentially inject the whole family with heroin. And once they were out, he would sexually abuse the two children. Now, it's important to note that Sophie had never ever met Mark in her entire life. Now, you might be thinking at this point, okay, where is Sem in all of this? As you can guess, Sem ate every single one of Sabrina's delusions up. Instead of being the voice of reason, the voice of rationale, the voice of sitting down, having a conversation, thinking things through, he decides to actually support Sabrina in all of this. Sabrina and Sem had reported Mark to the police around 30 separate times, and the police were just getting overwhelmed with all these stories and accusations. And of course, none of them were ever true, so they were never escalated, I guess. It's believed that Sabrina and Sem suffered from this really rare psychological disorder called folio ado. So the literal translation translates to madness for two, also known as dual psychosis. Sem was completely on board with everything that Sabrina said and wanted to do. He not only entertained her delusions, but actually helped her exercise and bring her delusions to life, I guess. With the pair sharing this delusion, it wasn't long until the abuse against Sophie began. So Sem and Sabrina started starving Sophie so they would deny her of food. At this point, they had also started to overwork her. So she went from working, decent hours to 80 hours a week. Now, just for context, full-time jobs in Australia tend to be 38 hours a week. Sometimes at the end of the week, I feel super, super exhausted. So I can't imagine working 80 hours a week and on top of that, only getting $63 a month. They also took her passport so she couldn't up and leave. And on top of that, they had confiscated her phone. So even when she did call family back home, Sabrina would always be monitoring these calls. And she essentially had no privacy. At that time, they were living in a 2-bedroom granny flat. So Sem and Sabrina had occupied one room, and the kids, who were aged 8 and 4, shared a room with Sophie. But eventually they had actually moved her and shoved her into this little tiny closet where they only had room for one tiny bed to be sort of stuck in. It eventually, unfortunately, escalated to physical abuse, slaps, and beatings with electrical cords and other instruments. And the couple had essentially agreed to start interrogating Sophie into confessing by applying relentless pressure on the poor girl. But Sophie kept telling them, this isn't happening. I've never met Mark. This is crazy. This is not true. And this, of course, angered the pair even more. And that's when the abuse started to really, really escalate. Now, a fish and chip shop owner by the name of Michael Cromer sees Sophie frequently because she would always come in and buy these fish and chips from him. So she comes into the store one day and she looks really, really stressed and upset. And, he asks her, hey, what's going on? And she opens up a little bit saying that, it's not that great. It's not what she expected. And Michael says, why don't you just get up and leave? Sophie replies, I just want what's best for the kids. I don't think it's going to be really good if I just up and leave. So I'm just going to stick it out and hopefully things get better. And Michael feels so bad for Sophie that he gives her this packet of fish and chips for free. And, Sophie's really touched by this warm sentiment and takes the food home. So as Sophie's eating this, eventually Sabrina finds out that Michael had given her a free packet of fish and chips. And this infuriates Sabrina. So Sabrina storms over to the fish and chip shop, and Sabrina throws this massive fit at Michael saying, you shouldn't be giving her free chips. This isn't how local shops work, blah, 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 which is really ironic considering that she had a meltdown about not paying for groceries early on. Anyway, none of my business. Back to the story. This is going off at Michael for all the wrong reasons. She's like, how dare you give her this? She's not deserving of this. Next time she comes in, you have to make sure she pays. And she is just so upset by the situation. Before Sophie can even speak, Sabrina grabs Sophie by her arm and just drags her out of the shop. And apparently Michael thought to himself, if this is how she's treating her in public, can you imagine how she's treating her behind closed doors? So the next time Sophie comes in, they actually had a conversation and Michael says, hey, why don't you reach out to mum to buy a plane ticket? And Sophie had explained that essentially she had already tried to call her mum, and her mum had sent her either some money or a plane ticket, but Sabrina must have found it and confiscated it, so she had no way of going home. So Michael then said, hey, I can buy you this ticket and no one has to know. But Sabrina really said, I can't. The kids come first and I have to make sure that they're okay. And that breaks my heart because I know that she was just looking out for the kids and unfortunately her safety was at risk. Sem had also threatened Sophie, claiming that he knew really influential people such as Donald Trump, and that if Sophie were to run back to France or escape this somehow, that she would be sent to jail. And obviously as a 21-year-old in a foreign country, and English isn't your first language as well, you'd feel absolutely terrified. Eventually Sabrina had told Sophie they weren't going to pay her altogether, and Sophie felt so defeated. But in saying that, Sophie never ever, wavered from her story. She always maintained the fact that she was innocent. And this had angered Sabrina and Sem even more because they were essentially getting nowhere. But bear in mind that Sophie has been starved, emotionally and psychologically abused. And on top of that, she felt like there was no way out. So Sabrina and Sem, being the absolute geniuses that they were, decided that they were going to record these interrogation sessions. They got to the point where Sabrina and Sem were like, okay, we need to come back with a game plan. And they decided to record these interrogation sessions over a period of 12 days. For 12 days, she was essentially subjected to physical torture, that she was waterboarded, she was emotionally and verbally abused, she was compared to a Nazi collaborator, and she was called worse than a murderer by Sem. She was kept up for days at a time. Sabrina and Sam also continuously said that if she confessed, she would be able to walk free and they would let her go back to France. But Sophie's denials led to continuous hours of abuse by the hands of Sam and Sabrina. And this was all captured on their smartphones. Even from reading the transcript, you can really tell that Sabrina adopted the role of the bad cop, whereas Sam was a little bit more of a good cop. At times, he would come in and would say things like, all we want is a confession. All you need to do is just say the words and then we'll sort of just leave you alone. You can go back to France, you can live your life. And it was just really weird that they were playing into this whole dynamic, thinking that this interrogation was, helping them or helping everyone else. After 12 days of intense interrogation, Sophie offered a false confession in hopes that Sabrina and Sam would maintain their word and let her go, but in fact, they did not. In the filmed confession, unfortunately, Sophie admitted that she had let Mark into the house. He had drugged Sam with heroin and allowed Mark to come in and then sexually assault Sam. So fast forward to the next day on the 19th of September, neighbors had noticed a very foul and disgusting smell coming from Sam and Sabrina's granny flat. They'd also seen fumes and black smoke, and they were getting really concerned, so firefighters were called to the granny flat. So firefighters come to the scene and they knock on the door, and Sam opens up the door, pretty small, and he's like, "Hey guys, what's going on?" And the firefighters are like, "Hey, we got calls, we've noticed that there's black smoke, what's happening?" And he's like, "Oh, me and the family just having a cute little barbecue, nothing to be worried about, it's all good." And he attempts to sort of close the door. But the firefighters are like, "Really?" They say, "Okay, that's all well and good if you're having a barbecue, but we still need to come in because there's been complaints and there's, obviously black smoke, so we need to come in and see what's happening." So when the firefighters come in, they actually do see a barbecue with some chicken on it, in fact. So they were like, "Okay, that's all well and good." But they turn around and they see this massive bonfire where the source of that really putrid smell and smoke is coming from. So they're like, "What did you chuck on there?" And Sam's like, "Oh, we just chucked on a sheep. It's fine, it's all good. We're just having a little friendly barbecue. Nothing to see here. Let's go." And the firefighters actually weren't fooled, and they did notice something suspicious in the flames. Upon further inspection, they had found human clothing, a pair of glasses, and what looked like human fingers and a human nose. They had obviously found the rest of the body later, but because it was burned so badly, they sadly couldn't identify it for 2 weeks. And when they did identify it as 21-year-old Sophie Lionnet, they had difficulties trying to rule a cause of death because the body was so badly burned. However, they could tell that it was likely from strangulation, a blow to her head, or drowning. She had all these big bruises on her arm, her back, and her chest. When she was alive, she also suffered from a broken jaw, 4 cracked ribs, and a fractured sternum. She had lived with that fractured sternum for 3 whole days. So an interrogation technique that Sam loved to do was to waterboard the nanny. So he would place a cloth over her face and then poured water on her face so that she couldn't breathe. Sophie was pressured to give a false confession. Instead of letting her go, the abuse escalated to the point of her murder, where she was beaten in between drownings. Now, after Sophie had passed away, at some point they had laid her on the bed, and Sam apparently insisted on having sex with Sabrina. Now, in court, Sabrina was mortified, she was crying, and she was saying that, it wasn't her idea. She hated the idea of having to have sex next to a dead body that was on the bed, and she felt like it was super disrespectful. But it's interesting to note that Sam and Sabrina were fighting and going against each other in court. They were both claiming that they were innocent and that they were both asleep during the time of her death. But luckily, the interrogation sessions that they had filmed on their smartphones had told a completely different story. After they had had sex with Sophie laying on the bed murdered, they decided to squeeze her into this suitcase and I guess, put that suitcase away until they thought of an idea to get rid of her body. And the pair decide to burn the body of the nanny. So one of the saddest details that I had read about the case was that Sophie was forced to sleep in this tiny little closet. And in that closet, the officers had found this little handwritten note. The note read, "Why me? I need help to stop them." Thinking about how alone and scared and afraid she would have been, especially leading up to the last few days of her life, would have been so terrifying. Even though she was described to be a very quiet, timid, and gentle soul, I do know that she was very resilient and very strong. For her to go through what she went through and to stay strong and to essentially not give in throughout the periods of intimidation and interrogation, I take my hat off to her. This is a really sad case, and I really feel for Sophie. She had these really high expectations of what London was going to be like, and unfortunately, Sem and Sabrina had crossed paths with Sophie. Thank you guys so much for joining me for True Crime Tuesday. I really appreciate you guys being here, and I will see you guys next week with a brand new true crime story. And until then, stay safe and take care. Bye.